There's a pattern that plays out quietly in offices, friendships, and families everywhere. Someone consistently accommodates, adjusts, and bends their stated limits. Over time, the people around them begin to treat them differently, not with hostility, but with something more subtle, a lack of consideration. The correlation between weak boundaries and diminished respect isn't coincidence. It's a predictable outcome rooted in how humans evaluate and respond to consistency in others. Boundaries, in the context of human behavior, are the limits individuals establish about what they will accept or tolerate in their interactions with others. These aren't physical barriers, but psychological and emotional lines that communicate personal standards. Research in social psychology suggests that boundaries serve as information. They tell others how to interact with someone, what behavior is acceptable, and where the limits lie. Respect, on the other hand, is the regard others hold for someone based on their demonstrated reliability, consistency, and self-regard. The connection between these two concepts is fundamental. When boundaries are clear and consistently maintained, they signal self-respect and create predictability. When boundaries are weak or inconsistently enforced, they generate confusion about what a person truly values. Psychology suggests that respect isn't granted automatically in social dynamics. It develops through observation of patterns. People form impressions based on what others demonstrate through their actions, not their words. When someone states a boundary but doesn't uphold it, observers unconsciously register the discrepancy. Over time, this inconsistency affects how seriously that person's stated preferences are taken. The pattern operates across all relationship types: professional colleagues, romantic partners, family members, and friendships all respond to the same fundamental behavioral cues. Most people don't consciously set out to test someone else's boundaries. Instead, what researchers observe is that humans naturally probe the limits of social situations to understand the unwritten rules. In a new workplace, for example, an employee might notice how others respond to last-minute requests or weekend work expectations. These aren't malicious tests, but information-gathering behaviors that help people navigate social environments. When someone's boundaries are unclear or inconsistently maintained, this exploration continues longer because the parameters never become clearly defined. The erosion of boundaries typically happens gradually. Someone might agree to one extra task outside their role, then another, then another. Each instance seems minor in isolation, but the cumulative effect establishes a pattern. Psychology indicates that people are pattern recognition machines. We constantly look for what predicts future behavior. When the pattern shows that stated limits don't match actual behavior, the stated limits lose their informational value. People begin relying on the observed pattern instead. Consider the common workplace scenario where someone says they can't take on additional projects due to workload, but then accepts them anyway when pressed. The first time, colleagues might accept the initial refusal at face value. The second time, they notice the contradiction. By the third or fourth instance, research suggests that people begin to expect the yes that follows the initial no. The boundary has become functionally meaningless because it doesn't predict actual outcomes. What matters in human perception isn't what someone says their limits are, but where their behavior consistently shows those limits actually exist. Several observable behaviors reliably indicate weak boundaries, and these patterns appear consistently across different contexts. Over-apologizing represents one of the most common signals. When someone apologizes excessively for reasonable actions, taking deserved time off, declining optional social events, or stating a preference, it communicates uncertainty about their right to those boundaries. Psychology suggests that apologies signal transgression, so excessive apologizing for non-transgressions implies the person views their own needs as somehow problematic. The inability to say no without extensive justification reveals another pattern. Research on communication indicates that clear boundaries require minimal explanation. When someone feels compelled to provide elaborate reasons for a simple decline, it often reflects discomfort with the boundary itself. This discomfort is perceptible to others. The lengthy justification actually undermines the refusal because it suggests the person is seeking permission rather than stating a decision. Observers unconsciously recognize this vulnerability and may push back, knowing the boundary isn't firmly held. Repeatedly accepting disrespectful treatment creates perhaps the most damaging pattern. When someone tolerates being interrupted, having their time wasted, receiving last-minute demands, or being spoken to dismissively, and continues the relationship without addressing it, they establish that such treatment is acceptable. Human behavior studies show that people generally treat others based on what those others demonstrate they'll accept. This isn't cruelty. It's adaptation to observed standards. If disrespectful behavior generates no consequences, it's likely to continue and often escalate. Consider the professional context where a manager regularly schedules meetings at the last minute, disrupting an employee's workflow. If the employee consistently accommodates this without ever addressing the pattern, the manager learns that this approach works. The behavior becomes normalized. Contrast this with an employee who, after the second instance, calmly notes that they need at least a day's notice for non-urgent meetings to manage their schedule effectively. This communicates a boundary. If maintained consistently, the manager adapts because the cost, scheduling conflict or having to find another time, exceeds the benefit of convenience. Changing stated boundaries based on external pressure represents another revealing pattern. Someone might say they aren't available for work communication after 8 p.m., but then respond to messages at 10 p.m. when a colleague expresses mild frustration. The boundary shift communicates that the stated limit wasn't a real boundary, but an opening position subject to negotiation. Psychology indicates that once others learn boundaries are negotiable through pressure, applying pressure becomes the logical strategy. This creates a cycle where boundaries weaken further over time. The loss of respect that follows weak boundaries isn't typically conscious or intentional. Research suggests it operates at a more fundamental level of social cognition. Humans are wired to evaluate the reliability of others as part of survival-related social navigation. Predictability allows us to make plans, anticipate reactions, and feel secure in relationships. When someone's boundaries are inconsistent, they become unpredictable in a specific way. Their stated preferences don't reliably predict their behavior. This unpredictability creates cognitive dissonance in observers. Psychology shows that when words and actions don't align, people trust actions. The stated boundary becomes categorized as noise rather than signal. More significantly, the inconsistency raises questions about what else might be unreliable about the person. If their boundaries shift under pressure, will their commitments, their opinions, their support? This generalization isn't necessarily fair, but research indicates it's a common cognitive pattern. The respect-reliability connection operates powerfully in professional environments. Studies on workplace dynamics show that colleagues and supervisors unconsciously evaluate who can be counted on to maintain standards. When someone demonstrates they'll compromise their stated limits, it suggests they might compromise other things: deadlines, quality standards, confidentiality, or team agreements. Even if this isn't true, the perception forms based on the observed pattern of boundary flexibility. Psychology also suggests that people subconsciously evaluate others' self-regard as a guide for how to regard them. This operates through a basic social logic. If someone doesn't value their own time, preferences, and limits enough to maintain them, why should others value those things? This isn't conscious reasoning, but an automatic social calculation. Someone who consistently demonstrates through their actions that their boundaries aren't important communicates, unintentionally, that respecting those boundaries isn't necessary. Weak boundaries in one relationship rarely remain contained there. Research on social dynamics indicates that patterns tend to spread because people communicate. In workplace settings, if one colleague learns that someone will accept tasks beyond their role without pushback, that information often spreads informally. Others begin making similar requests. The person becomes known as someone who will say yes, and requests flow accordingly. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle. As someone accepts more boundary violations, they become increasingly overextended. Being overextended makes it harder to enforce boundaries because the cost of doing so seems higher. Saying no might mean disappointing multiple people or failing to meet commitments that should never have been accepted. Psychology suggests this trap is common and difficult to escape without deliberate intervention. Professional credibility particularly suffers from weak boundaries. Studies indicate that authority, whether formal or informal, requires consistency between stated positions and actions. A project leader who says deadlines are important but routinely accepts late submissions without consequence teaches the team that deadlines aren't actually important. The stated standard becomes meaningless, and the leader's ability to set and maintain standards in other areas becomes questionable. Respect for their judgment and leadership erodes because their standards have proven unreliable. In personal relationships, weak boundaries gradually shift the dynamic. Research on interpersonal relationships shows that reciprocity, the balance of give and take, matters significantly for relationship satisfaction and stability. When one person consistently sacrifices their stated preferences while the other doesn't, imbalance develops. Over time, the person with weak boundaries may feel resentful while simultaneously continuing to enable the pattern. The other person, often without conscious awareness, begins to expect this accommodation and may feel inconvenienced when it's not provided. The long-term cost to personal authority is perhaps the most significant effect. Authority in this context isn't about power over others, but about being taken seriously, having one's words, preferences, and decisions treated as meaningful. Psychology indicates that personal authority develops from demonstrated consistency. When boundaries are weak, people learn to wait for the real answer that follows the initial no, to expect flexibility when they apply pressure, and to prioritize their own convenience over the stated preferences of someone who's demonstrated those preferences are negotiable. Research on behavior change suggests that rebuilding boundaries after a pattern of weakness requires both time and exceptional consistency. The initial period is often the most challenging because people have learned to expect the old pattern. When someone who previously accommodated everything suddenly starts declining requests or addressing disrespectful treatment, the change can generate confusion or even resistance. Psychology indicates this is normal. People push back against changes to established patterns because those patterns have been working for them. Studies show that effective boundary implementation requires several elements. First, clarity about what the boundary actually is. Vague limits are difficult to maintain and easy to negotiate away. Second, consistency in enforcement. One strong boundary followed by 3 weak ones reinforces that pressure works. Third, calm delivery without excessive emotion or justification. Research suggests that boundaries communicated as simple facts rather than apologetic requests are more likely to be respected. Fourth, acceptance that some relationships may change or end. Not everyone will respond positively to boundaries, and that information is valuable. It reveals who was invested in the relationship versus who was invested in the convenience. The initial discomfort of boundary establishment is well documented in psychological literature. People who've historically had weak boundaries often report feeling guilty, anxious, or selfish when they begin maintaining limits. This discomfort doesn't indicate wrongdoing. It indicates change. The nervous system has adapted to the old pattern, and any departure from it triggers stress responses. Research suggests this discomfort typically decreases with consistent practice as new patterns become normalized. What studies show about long-term outcomes is encouraging. People who successfully strengthen boundaries typically report improved relationships, not worse ones. The relationships that remain are more balanced and authentic because they're based on actual compatibility rather than one person's constant accommodation. Professional contexts also tend to improve. Colleagues learn new patterns of interaction, and the person's credibility often increases as their consistency becomes apparent. Psychology indicates that while the transition period is difficult, the long-term effects on both respect received and self-respect are substantially positive. The relationship between boundaries and respect operates through a straightforward mechanism. Boundaries communicate information about limits, and consistent enforcement makes that information reliable. Respect develops when people demonstrate through their actions that they value themselves and their standards enough to maintain them. When boundaries are weak or inconsistently held, the information they provide becomes unreliable, and the respect that depends on that reliability diminishes accordingly. This isn't about being rigid or uncompromising in all situations. Healthy relationships include flexibility and accommodation. The critical factor is whether that flexibility is a choice made from a position of clear boundaries or a default pattern of accepting whatever others prefer. Psychology suggests that the difference between these two is visible to others and significantly impacts how they perceive and treat someone. Understanding this dynamic offers a framework for evaluating current patterns and making informed choices about what to maintain or change. Boundaries aren't about controlling others or refusing reasonable requests. They're about establishing clear, consistent information about personal limits and following through on what's communicated. The respect that follows isn't something that can be demanded or negotiated. It develops naturally as a response to demonstrated consistency and self-regard. The patterns explored here play out in countless interactions every day, often without conscious awareness. Reflecting on your own boundary patterns and the responses they generate can offer valuable insights into relationship dynamics. What boundaries do you find easiest to maintain? Which ones tend to weaken under pressure? And how do you notice people responding to those different patterns? The comment section is open for your thoughts and experiences on this topic. Thank you for watching.